Hi guys, it's Coach Anthony back at you with another edition of Animate bringing chess to life. Continuing our Meet the Team series, today's piece is the Bishop, another member of the long range family. Let's examine its movements. The Bishop is the master of the diagonal. It can go backwards along the diagonal, forwards along the diagonal, and don't forget there's more than one diagonal, so we see the same thing again. The Bishop is indeed a very special piece. It is the piece that has the X factor. I would like you to pause the video and count how many squares the Bishop can go to. Hopefully you've paused the video and you've done that, so let's check the answer. We have the following squares that the Bishop can go to along this diagonal. We also have this diagonal, and we see that the Bishop has a potential of 13 squares that it can go to. Bishops have one major weakness, and that is they are stuck on one color square for the entire game. Time for some quick maths. If the Bishop can only travel on one color square, how many squares on the board could it potentially reach? Pause your video and we'll find out the answer in a moment. Hopefully you've paused your video, and we see that the Bishop is on white color squares, so it could move to a potential white color square, and we see that's a lot of green color squares. Now, I'm sure a lot of you were thinking, well, there's 64 squares on a chessboard. 32 of them are light color squares, 32 are dark color squares. So the answer must be 32. However, Coach Anthony's sneaky. He tricked you. Remember, the Bishop cannot attack a square that it's ready on. So the Bishop is sitting on D3, so you notice that's the square that's not highlighted. So the actual answer is 31. To help demonstrate the weakness of the Bishop, I've drafted in the Rook, if you remember the Rook from the previous series, to help us really shed some light on that. We're going to play a game called Bishop versus Rook. The idea is quite simple. The Bishop is going to try and take down the Rook, and the Rook is going to try and take down the Bishop. I'm sure many of you have already spotted a nice diagonal for the Bishop to go to, and that is square G2. And obviously we're really hoping that somehow Black won't spot what we're up to. Unfortunately, what we're up to has been spotted, and the Rook has a really nice answer, and that is just to go on to the dark squares and say to the Bishop, how are you going to attack me now? You can only go on the white squares, and this is one of the major weaknesses of the Bishop. Where could we possibly go to now? Okay. And we see that the Rook can attack the Bishop, and where would the Bishop really go? All it can ever do is run around on white squares. The only way that the Bishop can hope to win is by a massive mistake of some kind. So maybe if the Bishop tries to hide on a long diagonal or something like this, and then for some reason Black makes a horrible mistake, it's the only time such a thing can happen. And as we can see, it's game over for the Black team. But as long as that Black Rook keeps moving on the opposite colour squares, unfortunately, the bishop just doesn't have any hope of winning this game. To demonstrate the strength of the bishop, once again, I've drafted in those little guys. They're always appearing, aren't they? And I'm hoping that as soon as you look at these little guys, you may notice something, which is that unfortunately there is a big gap here and they're not side by side, which means they're not in their strongest formation. Means when they're attacked, they can't make, you guessed it, a pawn chain. So we're going to show how the bishop can really try to take advantage of this situation. We also remember that the pawns have two specific weaknesses. One of them is the fact that they can't protect themselves from the side, or if pieces get behind them, they can't really protect themselves from behind either. But it's very interesting to see how the bishop takes advantage of this situation. Our first move here is bishop to h3. And what we're trying to do is look for a diagonal that will be effective for our bishop. So what we're really looking for is this diagonal. And what we see is that the square e6 is a square that the pawn may pass through if they're only to move one on their first go. So if you were the black team here, it's quite obvious that one is not the move that you should make, because of course the pawn will be a goner. So it skips two squares. And what we can see now is the key diagonal that the bishop would like to rest on, so that it could take advantage of the fact that the square e4 is a square that the pawn on e5 has to pass through. So we arrive on f5 to take advantage of this diagonal, and once again black has a problem. If you move the pawn on g7 one square forward, it will be a goner. So it's quite obvious that it can only be two squares. Now our bishop all of a sudden has a little problem here, and that problem is that it could stay on the diagonal it's currently on, which is the green diagonal from b1 to h7, and if it stays on that diagonal, it will stop the pawn on e5 making any progress. The bishop can also go on to the yellow diagonal, and on this diagonal it will stop the pawn on g5 from making progress. There's also something else that happens when the bishop goes to g4, and that is it blocks the pawn on g5. So unfortunately it just can't move, which forces black's hand, because the only thing that's left on the board that they can move is the pawn on e5. But the problem is, if the pawn thinks it's going to go on its merry way all the way to e1, unfortunately it has to pass through the square e2, and our bishop is patiently waiting. Black continues their merry plan, and the bishop realizes all it has to do is just stay on this diagonal and do the special dance called the bishop shuffle. It just slides backwards and forwards along the diagonal, and unfortunately there's nothing that these little guys can do. So the pawn on e3 unfortunately once again has been blocked, and now something special happens. When pawns are blocked, it means that the other team's hand is being forced. The only thing that the black team can do is move the pawn on e5. But unfortunately, as soon as it moves it, hopefully you can see what's going to happen. So whenever you're forced to make a move that will make your position worse, there's a special German word for that, and that is Zugzwang. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Let's try and put a little bit of German on it. Zugzwang. So, unfortunately, the white bishop has now come to g4 and forced the pawn on e3 to come to e2. So that's a goner. One more time and it's all over for the black team. Excellent work by the bishop. In summary, the bishop is the master of the diagonal. They belong to the long range family, which means they love space and they hate to be blocked. It is the fourth most powerful member of the team. And sadly, bishops can only move on one colour square for the entire game. Okay guys, please like and subscribe and see you guys on the next video.